Sunday school this morning. And for those that are staying here, if you go ahead and take your Bibles and turn to the book of Psalms, chapter 122. Psalms 122, we're going to be continuing. We've been doing a series on the life of David, but also the teachings of David, looking at things that he wrote, especially in the psalm, that help to kind of give us guidance, but ultimately find their fulfillment in Jesus Christ, as David was what we sometimes refer to as a type of Christ, a foreshadowing of a Messiah, a king who would come and fulfill what, of course, David as a human being couldn't ultimately fulfill, which is God's ultimate vision for what kingship and lordship looks like. I was surprised to see a news headline yesterday. I shouldn't be surprised anymore. But it said this. It said, "Global stock market meltdown as fears grow the U.S. economy will collapse." And I quote, "Shares across the world tumbled Friday as investors panicked over signs of weakness in the U.S. economy. The NASDAQ index fell 3.2%, which means it now has lost more than 10% from a record high on July 11th. Japan's benchmark, Nikkei 225, suffered its second largest points drop in history and was down a staggering 5.8% overnight. On Friday morning, that's yesterday morning, unemployment among Americans rose to the highest level since October 2021, 4.3%, suggesting the U.S. economy is spluttering and raising recession fears." Now, I don't really put much stock into news headlines because I notice that there's a tireless challenge to shock people and to keep them on edge. Because clicks and views, of course, resonate and bring in more advertising revenue, right? The more people are looking and watching, the higher the price goes to advertise with those particular news groups. And the news isn't always just about news. It's about making money, of course. But what it did remind me of is that this only works because historically, unexpected turns have had a major world impact. The attack against Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, 9/11, more recently, COVID-19. The reality is that the world and humanity are more closely connected than we may be comfortable with. A dispute in a small Middle Eastern country leads to speculation of World War III if things get out of hand. Disunity anywhere can have a negative impact everywhere. David knew this all too well. God had led Israel into the promised land a few hundred years before David's time, but a dispute between the tribes undermined the goal of really securing the promised land. It's arguably that they spent sometimes more time fighting against each other among the 12 tribes than they did fighting the Canaanites. It was for this reason David made two central moves after he becomes king. And these two moves united the 12 tribes around the worship of God. And this is what David sings about in Psalm 122. Let's go ahead and take a look at that psalm now. It says, "I rejoiced with those who said to me, 'Let us go to the house of the Lord. Our feet are standing in your gates, O Jerusalem.' Jerusalem is built like a city that is closely compacted together. That is where the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, to praise the name of the Lord, according to the statute given to Israel. There the thrones for judgment stand, the thrones of the house of David. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May those who love you be secure. May there be peace within your walls and security within your citadels. For the sake of my brothers and friends, I will say, peace be within you. For the sake of the house of the Lord our God, I will seek your prosperity." The word of the Lord. So David sings about this visible unity of Israel that is centered around a joint pursuit of God. And this is what happens when we see him doing these two intentional moves. He's bringing all of this together. The first move that he makes after becoming king, a little time passes, but is he moves the capital of Israel from Hebron to Jerusalem. Now, the tribes have principally been divided between northern tribes and southern tribes. And this is the dividing line. So everything north are the northern tribes, and everything south are the southern tribes. And now Saul, the first king of Israel, comes from Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin. Now David comes from the tribe of Judah. This is where the line is between the north and the south. Later, when they divide after Solomon's time, they will divide according to this line. The northern part will become Israel, the southern part will be called Judah. But this problem occurs even in the time of Saul and the time of Judges. So David is from the southern tribe of Judah, and Hebron was a central city there. In fact, that's where he gets anointed king. And it becomes the capital of Israel for a few years until David realizes and discerns that he needs a more central, unifying location. Imagine that, moving more toward the center. Seems like today we just move, like we're like, what, you don't like Hebron? Let's go further south. You know? At this point, the people called the Jebusites inhabit Jerusalem. But it's the perfect location for a centralized capital for Israel because it rests upon the very border between the northern and southern kingdom, and it doesn't belong to either of them. So David captures Jerusalem, and then he does the second unifying move. After Saul was defeated by the Philistines up in the north, the Ark of the Covenant was captured. This is the large box, golden box that holds the Ten Commandments, and it holds manna, and it holds Aaron's staff, and it has a lid on which there's these two golden cherubim, and it stays in the Holy of Holies. And at this point, there's just a tabernacle. The temple has not been built yet. That tabernacle used to be in Shiloh, but David will be moving it to Jerusalem. But what happens to the ark is that it gets lost in battle, and it's taken to Akron, a Philistine city, and it's placed in the temple of Dagon. But as we mentioned the other week, something significant happens that really scares the Philistines. They wake up in the morning, and Dagon's temple, or his statue, has fallen over, and the head is broken off. And they realize that the God of Israel, Yahweh, is much stronger than their God, and they send the ark back to Israel with some oxen and a carriage. Now, it only gets as far as Kiriath Jearim, and David brings this ark, and he wants to come to Jerusalem again, but someone reaches out, and they just try to touch the ark in order to hold it from falling, and they die instantly. David stops everything. And he doesn't understand what's going on or why God would allow this to happen. And he calls some of those that are skilled and knowledgeable about the scriptures. And he finds out that only Levitical priests are allowed to carry the Ark of the Covenant. And so he goes back and he brings the Ark to Jerusalem. And it becomes the center, the unifying center of worship. Now, all of Israel would begin making regular pilgrimages to Jerusalem, sometimes multiple times a year. Mark Boda points out a significant point about pilgrimage, and if you think about it in the light of Jesus traveling with his family, they thought they were with him because they traveled together. He says, pilgrimage is a communal activity. We do not journey alone. But Jesus foretold of the fall of Jerusalem and the temple. Rome destroyed the city in 70 AD, and the people were scattered. But before that, Jesus declared that his own person is really God's temple. Destroy this temple, he said, and I will rebuild it in 3 days. It was this accusation that they used to arrest him. They didn't realize that Jesus was declaring himself to be the new unifying central place of worship. Not a place anymore, but a person. Jesus says, for no man comes to the Father except through the Son. We see this most clearly in Jesus' conversation with a Samaritan woman. The Samaritans worshipped on Mount Gerizim, which is in the northern region of Israel. And the Samaritan woman, she recognizes Jesus as a prophet after he tells her all about the details of her life, and she asks him a question. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. In his response to her, Jesus reveals a much deeper revelation. Jesus says, "Believe me, woman, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth." Now, it's not shocking that Jesus says that Mount Gerizim isn't the appropriate place for worship. But what would have been shocking to Jewish ears is that he says neither is Jerusalem. Boda says he does not define precisely the new location, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem, except to say that it is related to worshiping in spirit and in truth. However, this speech is anticipated at two earlier points in the Gospel of John, where there is an allusion to Jesus as the new central place of worship. So Jesus is now the Davidic unifying center of worship. In Matthew 18:20, Jesus says, "For where there are two or three that come together in my name, there I am with them." It is important that we never let anything else become central, or it will only act as a wedge to divide us, both from Christ and each other. In Jerusalem, at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a sepulchre is a tomb. So the church is where it's built over where Jesus was crucified and buried. So if you go through these doors, immediately on your right, there's a staircase. And you climb that staircase, and you're actually climbing Mount Golgotha. And on top, you'll see the tip of Golgotha. If you go further in, on the first level, and take a left, you'll head toward this other, looks like a large chapel over the tomb of Christ. And this was discovered by St. Helena, the mother of the Emperor Constantine, around 315 AD. And so what's interesting about this, if you're ever able to visit, and if your tour guide has enough time, he's going to point your attention to something rather odd. Up above that window, circled in red on here, is a ladder. And it's been there for a long time. So there are 6 different Christian denominations that share responsibility for the church. They share different parts of the church at different times. Some have certain parts, others are located in other parts. And they also share the responsibility of maintenance and cleaning. The latter is a result of a disagreement between some of these groups. So there was a monk out there, and he was cleaning the windows when someone got very upset because he was not on his own part, and that wasn't the place that he should be cleaning. Well, they argued about whose right it was to clean the windows over the entrance. Unfortunately, they never could agree. This ladder is made out of Lebanon cedar. It has been there since 1728. So unfortunately, it's become a symbol of the petty divisions within the church. And this is what happens whenever something other than Christ becomes central. Paul reminded a divided church, "For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you, except Jesus Christ and him crucified." In a prayer that Jesus prayed to the Father on behalf of all those who would come to believe through the disciples' teaching that would continue on for centuries, now 2,000 years later. In John 17, Jesus says, "I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one, I and them and you and me. May they be brought to complete unity, to let the world know that you have sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. This, of course, this kind of unity in the church only happens when Jesus becomes the unifying factor, when his sacrifice on our behalf becomes the central unifying factor of our faith. Rather than a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, Christ's followers gather together around a communion table. Christians, above all others, should be the world's best mediators. In fact, in 2 Corinthians 5:18, Paul tells us that God has given us the ministry of reconciliation. I was studying at Eastern Mennonite Seminary when I discovered something that I just thought was great. You know, the Mennonites are a very peaceful people, and they have a number of master's degrees and graduate level certifications and trainings in things like faith-based peace building and conflict resolution and restorative justice. I thought, what if all churches were equipping people in this kind of ministry, learning how to get beyond our differences, how to agree to disagree on non-essential issues, and how to make the unifying factor our faith in a God who is bigger than us and all the issues. Psalm 122 reveals the role that the community plays in the journey to Zion. Today, as we prepare ourselves for communion, I invite you to reflect on those in your life who have been catalysts for your journey of faith. Those who have encouraged you with similar words or other words that invite you, just as Psalm 122 invites us, to let us go to the house of the Lord. In other words, let us draw in near to God. Let this be what unifies us. Thank God for these people by name. And as we pass the bread and then the wine, there'll be time in between to be able to reflect and to pray. Thank God for these people by name. If you don't have these people currently in your life, people that help bring you and grow you in the faith and support you and walk alongside of you, then ask God to bring these kinds of companions alongside of you. I remember when I had just moved to Michigan and I was looking for a faith-filled friend. And so I was praying for one. And one day I walk into this church and I see this guy sitting in a chair in the fellowship area. And suddenly it just dawns on me, like I just have this inner conviction. That's the guy. Brian and I became friends for a number of years. We just did everything together, especially going to all kinds of services. And we encouraged each other in the faith and helped keep each other accountable. But we also pursued God together. If you ask for this type of thing, God will provide it. As we examine our walk with God, let us be sure to ask God's forgiveness for the things that we've allowed to divide us that are not Him. And let's refocus our lives and our faith on what is central: the love and the grace of God revealed through His Son, Jesus Christ. He alone is the beginning and the end of all our differences. To know God's love in Christ is all we'll ever need. Today, as we